In the podcast for Module 11, we are going to be exploring Impressionism. Now, many people are already familiar with Impressionism, or at least some of its artists, such as Claude Monet, or Renoir, or Degas. In fact, Impressionism is often thought of as sort of conservative and culturally entrenched art, not very cutting edge. You can buy Impressionist mugs and umbrellas and shopping bags, and Impressionist artwork has become very popular. Uh, it wasn't always this way, though. These sort of commercial uh, expressions of Impressionism disguised the fact that when it came on the scene, it was extremely cutting edge and avant garde. It was shocking, it was different from anything people had seen. So, even though nowadays we may be very used to Impressionism, when it emerged on the scene in the 19th century, it was a very new, radical thing. And in this module, I want to explore some of the radical innovations of Impressionism and how it very much marked a turning point in the history of art, especially in how artists perceived nature and life around them. So let's get started with Module 11, Impressionism, a new way of seeing. In order to understand why Impressionism was shocking and innovative, it's important to first look at the art scene that was going on in France in the 19th century. Basically, the French art world was ruled by academies and salons. And academies such as the Royal Academy of Arts in England and the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in France were the official sort of state-sponsored schools that artists would go to learn how to paint, draw, and sculpt. And they encouraged basically one sort of style of art, and that style was very conservative. It was something of a mix of neoclassicism and romanticism. It was always highly realistic, and typically what was taught at these schools was the only worthy subject matter is great stories from the past, maybe Bible stories or tales from ancient history or from classical literature. So here are a couple of examples of paintings that would have been produced by the French Academy, this Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. This is by Jean-Léon Gérôme. It's called Diogenes. It depicts the famous Greek philosopher who lived in a bathtub and was known for making these outlandish sort of philosophical statements by his actions. He would carry around a lamp in broad daylight, claiming to look for an honest man. So notice that this is kind of neoclassical subject matter, right? This is a Greek philosopher. Notice how it's painted. It's realistic. It's very tight. By the way, Jerome, we've already encountered. If you remember when we were studying ancient Roman history, if you recall the painting of the gladiators, Pollice Verso, that was Jerome. So he was someone who was obviously obsessed with Greek and Roman subjects. Now this is quintessential academic art. This is a subject that would have been approved of by the teachers at these academies. This is the sort of thing that students would have been encouraged to paint because this is an important subject. It is referencing great history, our philosophical traditions, all that sort of thing. It is not coarse and common like realist art would have been. Here's another example of academic art by William Adolphe Bouguereau, another French painter. It's called Nymphs and Satyr. And this is a mythological subject, right? Here is a satyr, or we might call him a faun. You can see a man with the upper body of a human being and the lower body of a goat. And there are these nymphs who are kind of teasing him and dancing around him. This is a kind of corny subject matter, right? It's sort of cheesy and saccharine and romantic. I can't help myself. I still kind of like it anyway. I think it's well painted. But again, this is totally academic art. It is referencing something from the past. It is painted very carefully, kind of in a neoclassical way. Notice, for example, the careful shading on the body of the satyr, the way the chiaroscuro is very gradually handled to make his body seem rounded. Everything in this picture, every leaf, every blade of grass, every bit of hair has been carefully and lovingly painted. None of it has been rushed through. All of it is tightly detailed. Now, this sort of painting was the in thing in France in the mid to late 1800s, academic painting. And if you went to one of these academies, these state-sponsored art schools, and learned this way of painting, you probably had some work that you could enter in the official state-sponsored art competition, which is called the Salon. And every year, aspiring artists would enter their academic paintings in the salon, hoping to get into the show and win recognition and awards. And if you were an artist in France at this time and your work got into the salon, it basically guaranteed your career. You had made it as an artist and you were set, and people would want to buy your work. It was great exposure for these artists. This is what was ruling the Paris art scene at the time. And if you wanted to do innovative, cutting edge work, typically it was not being taught in the academies, and second, it tended not to get into the salons. The realist painter Courbet, who we looked at in the last module, was rejected from the Salon in the 1850s, and he was so disgusted with this that he set up his own competing exhibition in 1855. And later he wrote this: "It is high time that someone have the courage to be an honest man, and that he say that the Academy is a harmful, all-consuming institution, incapable of fulfilling the goal of its so-called mission." So already there was dissatisfaction with the academic French system. Into this world of salons and academies comes an artist who brings some great innovations to painting, but in his heart he really just wants to get into the salon. His name is Edouard Manet. Here is Manet's most famous painting, the one that put him on the map. It's called Luncheon on the Grass. And this was submitted for the Paris Salon and totally rejected. And we look at it and we think, big deal. Why was this rejected? Why was this so shocking? Well, there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, this scene is one of contemporary Parisian life. This woman is not a goddess or an allegorical figure, and these men are not great figures from history. They're ordinary 1800s Parisians, and they're hanging out in a park. And this is unacceptable to people who are used to scenes of nymphs and satyrs and Greco-Roman vignettes from history. This is unacceptable subject matter. In many ways, the subject matter ties into the realist stuff that we have been looking at, the works of Courbet and Millet and Homer. So the subject matter itself is shocking. It's also considered scandalous and kind of immoral. Here this woman is nude in the company of these well-dressed Parisian dandies. And again, she's not an allegorical figure. So that's considered inappropriate. One critic wrote a scathing review of this painting. He said, "A commonplace woman, as naked as can be, shamelessly lolls between two dandies dressed to the teeth. These latter look like schoolboys on a holiday, perpetuating an outrage to play the man. This is a young man's practical joke, a shameful open sore." And again, we probably nowadays look at this painting and think, what's the big deal? But compared to the quote-unquote great art that was being shown in the salons at this time, this was inappropriate. Now, in addition to the subject matter being pretty shocking, there was a second reason this painting offended people, and that was the technique that was used, the way it was painted. Remember, in the Bouguereau painting, there was very carefully rendered chiaroscuro. Everything was rounded. Shadows were used to describe volume, and the figures in that painting looked three-dimensional, and they looked very solid and rounded. And this is a trend that continued back from neoclassicism. Remember how solid those figures were. Manet, on the other hand, has very few shadows. Look at the woman's body, for example. There are a few sort of kind of dark edges under her thigh and under her arm, but there's not a lot of careful chiaroscuro. It's a lot flatter. It almost seems as if this scene was painted from a photograph taken with a flash that washes out all the shadows. The folds in the clothing of the men are not extremely carefully done. A few quick brushstrokes kind of lay in those folds. So there's something that was kind of slapdash and quickly done appearing about this. And a lot of critics said, well, this is just sloppy painting. This artist, Manet, is not willing to take the time to actually render out folds in clothing. His painting looks too flat, and it's pretty poor craftsmanship. Now, all of this stuff was kind of news to Manet and was kind of shocking to him. He was someone who definitely wanted to get into the salon, and really what he was doing in this painting was simply updating an old master composition from the Renaissance. He was paying tribute to an earlier image by a Renaissance artist named Raimondi. Let's look at it. It's called The Judgment of Paris, and you see this scene with multiple figures. But look in the lower right-hand corner, there is an assortment of three figures who are kind of lounging around. Here is a close-up of those three figures, and it's set against a crop from Luncheon on the Grass. And you can see the similarities in the composition. And nowadays we might say, this is plagiarism. Manet is ripping off Raimondi. Well, yes, that's kind of true, but in his mind, he is paying tribute, he's paying homage to this work of a Renaissance master. And people coming to see Luncheon on the Grass would have been familiar with Raimondi's image, and they would have known that Manet is reaching back to the past and finding a touchstone in this great work of Renaissance art. So it's not really copying, it's more like paying tribute. And it shows Manet's sort of classical tendencies, or at least his traditional tendencies. He very much loved the work of Renaissance artists and old masters, and he felt he was doing them honor by kind of reimagining their compositions in a contemporary setting. Well, this certainly did not go over well with the critics. And of course, Manet did not get this work into the Salon that year, the Salon of 1863. However, that year there were quite a few works that were rejected from the official salon, and some people kind of liked these works. In fact, they raised a public outcry protesting the rejection of some of this decent work. And the outcry was so loud that the King of France at that time, Napoleon III, decided to stage an exhibition of works that had been rejected from the regular salon. This was called the Salon des Refusés, or Salon of the Rejected. And at this work, people were able to see paintings like Luncheon on the Grass for the first time. And the Salon des Refusés was really popular. A lot of people went, even if they only went to make fun of some of the art, which certainly did happen. Let's look at Manet's other really famous and shocking work. This is called Olympia, and it was greeted with a similar sort of reaction to Luncheon on the Grass, and for similar reasons. It depicts a nude woman who is obviously not a goddess or allegorical figure. She's an ordinary modern woman of Manet's time. Furthermore, she's a prostitute. Her profession is kind of heightened by the fact, obviously she's naked, but she has like a little ribbon around her throat, and she has shoes on her feet and a flower in her hair, all marks of a prostitute. And there she is in her bedchamber, and there's a woman who brings her flowers, probably as some sort of gesture from one of this woman's customers. What really shocked people was the unashamed sort of glance that this prostitute offers us as we look at the painting. She gazes out at us almost defiantly, but certainly just matter-of-factly, as if we had just walked into the room and she's like saying, "Oh, it's you. Why are you here?" So there's something confrontational about this painting. A prostitute does not cast her eyes down in this painting. Instead, she looks directly into our eyes. Also, the way it's painted, kind of like Luncheon on the Grass, was considered sketchy and slapdash. It's kind of loosely painted. There are no strong shadows and carefully rendered chiaroscuro. There's something very flat. In fact, there's very little shadow on this woman's body. She's kind of outlined. One critic described this woman as a courtesan with dirty hands and wrinkled feet. Her body has the livid tint of a cadaver displayed in the morgue. Her outlines are drawn in charcoal, and her greenish, bloodshot eyes appear to be provoking the public. So again, it's not just the subject matter, it's the style. It's how Manet is painting these pictures in a very flat manner, um, in a way that is very counter to what is being shown in the academies at the time. And similar to Luncheon on the Grass, this painting, Olympia, was inspired by an older artwork. And here it is, Titian's Venus of Urbino. You can see the pose is similar and the composition is kind of similar too. A bed that is along the bottom and kind of props up on the left-hand side. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the two. So again, you can see Manet paying tribute to art of the past. I think in his heart, he's very much in love with the works of old masters. He's not setting out to completely reinvent all of art, but he does these updates of old master works in kind of a shocking way. And Manet is going to emerge as the premier cutting-edge avant-garde artist at this time. And several young artists are going to be drawn to this innovative painter who seemingly defies the convention of the Academy and does what he wants, painting in very flat ways, contemporary subject matter. Let's look at one more work by Manet. Here it is, A Bar at the Folies Bergère. It shows a woman behind a counter, and she is the barmaid. You can see all the wine bottles and containers. She is ready to serve customers. Behind her is a mirror. And in this mirror, we see reflected people at tables throughout this deep space. We also see the barmaid herself reflected in the mirror. You can see on the right-hand side, her back is to us and she's talking to a man. Yet somehow the reflection doesn't seem right. It seems like the reflection should be right behind her, but instead the reflection is to the side. And this is an example of Manet kind of messing around with reality, sort of doing what he wants, because it feels right in the picture. And this is going to be one of the innovative things that artists start doing. Also, look at how this work is painted. Manet, this is about 20 years after Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia, and Manet's brushstroke has gotten even looser. This is even further away from that academic painting that we saw in Gérôme and Bouguereau. It is certainly not smooth. We see kind of obvious brushstrokes. And this is increasingly going to be a hallmark of painting in the late 1800s. More and more artists are going to start using this sort of loose painting technique. Let's talk about some of the artists who became known as the Impressionists. In many ways, Edward Manet is the father of Impressionism because he is the first one to come along and kind of stick it to the academies. And young artists are going at this time are going to look at him and say, "Wow, here is a guy who is defying the conservative conventions of what's happening in painting at this time. We really like him and want to sort of follow him." One of these young people who appreciated Manet is someone with a very similar name, just change one letter, and you have this artist's name, Claude Monet. And Monet is considered one of the quintessential Impressionist painters. In fact, when many people think of Impressionism, it's Monet that they first think of. So let's dig into some of his work and see if we can understand what Impressionism is all about. Here is the painting that gave Impressionism its name. It's called Impression Sunrise. And if you think about it in the context of the academic paintings that we started off with, you can see perhaps why Impressionism is a new shocking thing. Look at this painting. It seems like it was very quickly done. It consists of a lot of loose brushstrokes. Definitely does not have the polish and finish of academic paintings. And when a critic saw this, he termed this painting and others like it Impressionist, taking as his cue the title of this painting. And in a way, he was saying these artists are really just kind of doing sketches. Impression is sort of a word for a sketch. And these artists are doing these sort of quick sketches that are just sort of registering their optical sensations. And so after this critic wrote this article, the name stuck, and all artists who were in Monet's circle kind of got this name. Now let's talk about what the Impressionists were actually about, what they were trying to do. First of all, Impressionist subject matter is going to be kind of like realist subject matter. It's going to tend to be everyday, here and now sorts of things. So they're going to be documenting contemporary life. Second, Impressionists are going to be spending a lot of time painting outdoors. And this is sort of a new thing in art history. Artists have done quick little sketches outdoors before, but typically if they wanted to do a landscape painting, they would bring their sketches back to their studio and complete the landscape painting inside. So artists like Monet are starting and finishing paintings outside entirely, and this is a new thing in art history. A third, and really one of the most important things about Impressionism, is that it is interested not so much in capturing solid form. Instead, the Impressionists were interested in capturing on canvas the sensation of light that bounces off objects and falls on your eyes. This was in line with scientific studies of the day that realized that color is nothing more than the parts of the spectrum that are reflected off of any given object or scene and fall on your eyes. And the Impressionists realized this, and they decided that their philosophy would be to paint the light that is falling on their eyes. So they're not really, and a true Impressionist would say, he's not really painting the object itself. Instead, he's painting the light and color that are bouncing off of the objects and hitting his eyes. In other words, he is capturing the optical impression that is falling on his eyes. Another aspect of Impressionism is their innovative use of color. They are going to do things like set complementary colors next to each other, such as red and green, and make them kind of play off of one another to seem more intense. They are also going to take their tube of black paint and throw it away. Impressionists do not use black. They believe that black does not exist in nature, and they decide to mix their dark colors, for example, the shadows under trees, with blues and violets. So Impressionist paintings are going to have this really sort of brilliant sense of color about them due to these creative ways that Impressionists are using colors. A lot of Impressionists are also using, as we see here in Impression Sunrise, quick, loose brushstrokes. This really captures the sensation of light sort of flickering and bouncing off of things. We certainly get a sense that light is bouncing off of the water in this picture. So they're not going to have the tight, crisp lines of neoclassicism or academic painting. Instead, their paintings are going to be sort of loose and fuzzy and often have this feeling of kind of vibrating. So really, Impressionism is in many ways kind of a scientific movement. It is, above all else, about capturing the fleeting, temporary changes in light that happen on a landscape. Let's look at some more Monet. This next slide shows a series that he painted of a cathedral called Rouen Cathedral. Monet was so interested in the way that colors change as light changes that he would go out to a certain spot outside and he would set up an easel and he would paint all day. As the sun moved across the sky, he noticed that shadows change and also the colors on things change. You see, the Impressionists believed that color is totally relative. Objects don't have any sort of permanent color. It all depends on the type of light that is falling on that object at a given time. And if we look at this series of the facade of this cathedral, you can see that's true. This is the cathedral at different times of day, and you can see the different colors that are being used. Monet would often go out to a location with a stack of canvases under his arm, and he would set up one canvas and start painting. And when the light had changed, he would take that canvas off his easel and put a new canvas on and start painting the new shadows and the new colors. And in this way, he could spend all day in front of one scene painting the same thing over and over. He never seemed to get tired of it. He was someone who was utterly fascinated with how color changes as light changes. Here's another example of a series of Monet paintings, haystacks, and he would paint them again and again. So you can see these 4 images of haystacks, and by the way, there are many, many more, were painted at different times of day, and that definitely affects the kinds of colors that are on them. Notice also that these, like the cathedral paintings, are painted with these little tiny brushstrokes, because remember, the Impressionists are trying to simulate light. They're not trying to simulate solid form. So we have a sense that little specks of light are kind of bouncing off of these haystacks and the grass and the field around them. Another image here, a woman with a parasol. We have a sense that the sun is behind her. Perhaps she is blocking it, or maybe it's a little bit to the side, off of the edges of the canvas. And you can see just the hundreds of little tiny brushstrokes that are making up this picture. Beautiful sense of light in this painting. We have a sense of the sun bouncing off of the grass back into her dress on the bottom of her sleeve. So you can see that wonderful reflected light that's there. Monet was so obsessed with the way colors change as light changes. He would do pretty obsessive things. There are stories about him having a special boat constructed with little slots in the bottom of the boat, a flat bottom boat. And he would anchor himself in a river or on a lake, and he would set up his canvases in these slots and paint picture after picture. So this is definitely an obsession of his. This next image shows how far that obsession went. This is a picture of his wife Camille on her deathbed. As she was dying and the colors in her face were changing, Monet set up his canvas and painted her. So, kind of sad. Probably not what you'd want your husband or wife doing while you were on your deathbed, but perhaps this is his way of coping with her death. This next image shows one of the subjects that Monet was really famous for, pictures of lily pads. So here's one of his water lily paintings. Again, the very loose brushstrokes capturing the sensation of light reflecting off of this water. He painted lots and lots of water lily pictures. He had these beautiful gardens at Giverny, and he loved painting the lily pads in the pond. And towards the end of his life, some of his water lily pictures got really big and also really abstract, just these pure patches of color. So it's interesting to see Monet move towards abstraction as he gets older. All right, let's look at another Impressionist. This is Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Renoir is an Impressionist who never paints a depressing picture. Pretty much all of his pictures are scenes of people being happy and having fun. Here is one of his famous ones, Le Moulin de la Galette. This was a cafe in Paris, and it has an outdoor area. And here you can see people outside, sitting at tables, sitting on benches. Also people in the background dancing. And there's a sense of sunlight flickering and filtering through the trees and putting all these spots on the ground and on the people. And you can see on the ground where the people are dancing, the shadows are kind of blue. And patches of sunlight appear on the back of the man who's leaning over the chair in the lower right foreground. Two of the central characters in this painting are a woman and apparently her daughter, these two women who are on the bench. This is classic Renoir. Over and over, Renoir paints these sort of dark-eyed women. It's one of the things he's known for. This painting, Nude in the Sun, is one of his dark-eyed women, and like Monet, Renoir has this sort of flickering brushstroke. In fact, I think of Renoir's paintings as made, they almost look like feathers, these little sort of fuzzy wisps of paint. So look at the fuzziness of this woman and compare this in your mind to the academic painting that we started with, and you can see there's a big difference. Impressionism initially, as I said before, is rejected. It's shown in places like the Salon des Refugiés, but eventually it gains momentum and becomes more and more mainstream and influential. But that is not after something of a struggle to survive. Renoir, I should mention, was kind of a boisterous, lusty character. He supposedly said things like, "I consider my nude finished when I feel like smacking her bottom." So, if you're talking about joie de vivre, the joy of life, Renoir is your painter. All of his paintings are pretty happy. On the Terrace is another example of Renoir. Upbeat painting, a woman and her daughter sitting outside. Look at the bright colors. Look at the way, especially the trees in the background, are handled with little tiny flecks of paint and rich, vibrant, saturated colors. Our next artist is a guy named Edgar Degas, and Degas is something of a reluctant impressionist. In fact, he is an artist who doesn't really like being identified with the impressionists, but he has similar concerns, so he sort of gets lumped in with them. Degas is known first and foremost for painting ballet scenes. So we have a lot of pictures of ballerinas rehearsing and dancing and stretching, all of that sort of thing. Part of this is probably because Degas had some problems with his eyesight. It was hard for him to be outside. Unlike Renoir and Monet, Degas didn't do much outdoor painting. He preferred darker indoor areas. So a lot of his pictures take place inside. So we'll see some examples of those. Here is the dance class from 1874. And in this, we can see one of Degas' obsessions. He was very interested in how pictures were composed, how the figures were placed on the canvas, and how visual balance was being achieved. If you'll remember, in an earlier module, we talked about compositional balance and how you can have symmetrical or asymmetrical balance. And Degas was very interested in asymmetrical balance. He didn't like having things right in the middle of the canvas. He liked pushing things over to the side. And we can certainly see that in the dance class, where the biggest figure is the ballerina closest to us on the left, and she's not in the middle, she's kind of over to the side. And then she's balanced out over on the right-hand side by the dance teacher. You can see him leaning on a stick. Another great example of an asymmetrical Degas composition, dancers practicing at the bar. Here the two figures are pushed all the way over to the upper right, and they are balanced out with that little watering pitcher that's sitting on the floor. And kind of a humorous aspect of this painting is that the little watering pitcher is mimicking the stretching pose of the dancer on the right. It's just kind of funny. She looks sort of like a water pitcher, so lots of fun. Here's another Degas image. It's actually done in pastel, which is a type of colored chalk. Degas really enjoyed working in pastel, and he was one of the first artists to do pastel drawings and present them as finished works. So this is just a marvelous, moody little drawing here, which seems to be dominated by cool colors as these dancers are perhaps backstage preparing to go on stage. Here's another Degas image. It's one of his more rare outdoor images, Place de la Concorde. Again, the asymmetrical composition. Something else that Degas is known for, in addition to his asymmetricality, is the way he is cropping his paintings. Normally, up to this point in academic painting, you put all the main stuff, all the figures or the still life, whatever's the main subject of your painting, completely contained on the canvas. Degas, on the other hand, will sometimes crop figures off in very curious ways. Look at the man on the left, for example, wearing the top hat with the cane, the way his body is just sort of cut off. Look at the three figures in the lower right, and the dog, really, how they're just chopped off at the bottom. This is the influence of photography. Degas was very influenced by candid snapshots, and the way if you just take a picture spontaneously, say of a crowd scene, some people will be in the frame and some people will be cropped off. So those are two qualities of Degas pictures, this asymmetricality and the cropping, that we can see quite frequently, and it's one of the hallmarks of Degas. It's one of the ways you can know it's actually Degas. Just a couple of more examples. This is called Absinthe. A man and a woman sit in a cafe by themselves, looking kind of lonely and alienated from each other. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the table that they're sitting at doesn't have any legs. It's sort of like these tables are floating here, as if Degas is mainly interested in the shape of the tables rather than making them seem like realistic things that actually occupy space. This might be a good time to mention that one of the big rages in Paris, especially amongst artists at this time, was Japanese woodblock prints. These are prints that are made by carving a block of wood and making it into something kind of like a rubber stamp, and then printing these images onto paper. Here are a couple of examples of Japanese woodblock prints. And the sensibilities of these Japanese prints definitely influenced Degas' compositions. Notice that they tend to be kind of asymmetrical, and sometimes they have very unusual perspective. Look, for example, at the print on the right and this tub that this woman is bathing in. She's dipping handkerchiefs in it and getting water out, and there's something kind of awkward about the perspective of the tub. Compare that to this next Degas image, a pastel drawing called The Tub, and notice how asymmetrical it is. Notice that we have this shelf that's cutting in at a gentle diagonal on the right-hand side, and there's something kind of flat about it. That flatness is very appealing to Degas and other Impressionists. So photography and Japanese prints are both a big deal for Degas. He's actually one of my favorite Impressionists, although he's not someone I would want to be friends with if he were still alive today. There are stories about him that he was kind of a grouch. Someone once asked him why the women in his pictures were ugly, and he said, "Women in general are ugly." He was kind of antisocial, kind of a loner, had a very small circle of friends. So in many ways, kind of the opposite of Renoir, who seemed to be full of the joy of life. All right, let's look at one more artist. This artist is often mentioned in the same breath as the Impressionists, although he was not officially an Impressionist. He's a sculptor. His name is Auguste Rodin, and he's one of the most important sculptors in the entire history of art. Some people say he single-handedly changed the course of modern sculpture. And one of the reasons we're talking about him in this unit on Impressionism is that he had great concerns with light and shadow in his works. He would often make sculptures that had very rough surfaces. So some of these ridges and mounds would catch light, and other places would be sort of gouged out hollows that would catch shadow. He was incredibly aware of the way that light played off of three-dimensional form. So in that way, he was similar to the Impressionists who painted because they were all about the effects of light. But obviously, he is not really working with color and that sort of thing. He's working with three-dimensional volume and mass. Let's go through some of Rodin's work and see if we can figure out what he's all about. You should know that kind of like academic painting, academic sculpture at this time was ruled by a very conservative crowd. Pretty much the only types of sculptures that were considered worthy or considered excellent were sculptures of gods or goddesses or allegorical figures, usually carved in marble and usually very smooth and finished. No rough surfaces, everything sanded and polished. And often these people were kind of idealized. They had perfect bodies and perfect youthful faces. So that is the context that Rodin is working in. Here's one of his first major sculptures. It's called The Age of Bronze. It is a single figure in a contrapposto pose. He's kind of taking that from the Greeks. And this figure is in kind of a mysterious stance. His left arm is bent at the elbow, and his hand is in a fist. Initially, this figure was holding a spear in some of the original versions of this, but Rodin didn't like how that interfered with the view of the sculpture from some angles. So he took out the spear, and so that hand is just sort of stuck there in midair. The other arm, the right arm, is bent, and the hand is on top of the head, so you can see that. When Rodin first cast this figure and presented it, a lot of people scratched their heads over it. They said, you know, this figure doesn't look idealized, doesn't have a perfect body like the gods and goddesses we're used to. The proportions aren't as sort of heroic he seems more like an ordinary man. In fact, there's something shockingly ordinary about this guy. And it was so realistic, in fact, that Rodin was accused of having cast this figure off of a live person. In other words, taking a live model and taking molds directly off of that person's body. And of course, Rodin didn't do this. He actually sculpted this figure out of clay while looking at a model. But it was the ultimate insult at this time to say that you have actually copied this figure by taking molds off a real human body. So Rodin presented his evidence for this sculpture that he had actually worked from a live model and had not taken any casts off of it. And everybody believed him and felt bad about accusing him of cheating. And they acclaimed him as a great sculptor. And from then on, he began to get commissions. Here's one of the commissions that Rodin was awarded. It's a doorway. There was a museum of decorative arts planned in Paris, and they hired Rodin to create an entranceway, sculptures for a post and lintel and 2 doors. And this would be sort of an exciting, energetic, and fun to look at entrance to actually walk into. And this was a project that Rodin actually worked on his entire life, and it was never finished. And in fact, that wasn't a big deal because the Museum of Decorative Arts was never built. This was called the Gates of Hell. Rodin took his inspiration for this sculpture from Dante's Inferno, which gives us basically a guided tour of hell. So we have all of these bodies, hundreds of bodies, sort of tumbling and writhing. Some of these figures falling down into hell, some of them being dragged down. Here are some details. But perhaps more important than being a finished work in its own right, which it actually was never finished. Rodin was still working on it when he died, and it was only cast in bronze after his death. Instead of being a finished work, what is more important is that he would make little figures for the gates of hell, and he'd be like, oh, that's kind of cool. I like that. I'm going to make a big version of that. So throughout his life, the gates of hell served as a laboratory for Rodin, in which he would find poses that he liked and blow them up into large-scale sculptures. Check out this figure. It occupies sort of this kind of the upper center of the gates of hell. There's a figure presiding over all of these bodies that are tumbling down into hell. And you might recognize this figure. It's called the Thinker. This man ponders and broods over everything that's going on below him. This is one of the poses that Rodin really liked, and he decided to make this into a larger-than-life sculpture. So here are a couple of images of that. Notice the really rough surfaces on this sculpture. This is something that, again, was contrary to what was happening in academic sculpture at this time. But it marks Rodin as someone who is interested in the play of light and shadow. Also, Rodin, kind of like Michelangelo, tended to exaggerate anatomy a little bit if he felt that it helped the sculpture sort of have a bigger emotional punch. So, for example, in The Thinker, this guy has massive hands and feet that are very emotionally expressive. Also, if you sit in your chair at home and try to do this pose, you'll find it's a little bit awkward. This isn't a natural pose that people usually assume. So there again, Rodin is kind of changing what is natural in order to make it a little more expressive. If you look at the face of this figure, it's kind of smashed in and lopsided looking. It's not traditionally beautiful. All of these things would have been shocking to people of the time, at least until they got used to it, but they were hallmarks of Rodin, and they were some of the innovations he was really interested in bringing into sculpture. One of the big influences on Rodin was Michelangelo, particularly Michelangelo's slaves or prisoners, those figures that are halfway encased in marble and half carved, and he loved that unfinished quality that they had. And sometimes he would bring that unfinished quality into his finished works. Sometimes he would simply exhibit fragments of torsos or torsos with legs that had no arms and heads. So there's definitely this kind of relationship between Michelangelo and Rodin. One of the things I really love about The Thinker is the way the feet seem to be sort of clutching the rock. The toes are almost kind of gripping the surface. that the feet are propped on. It's just kind of cool. It's almost sort of ape-like and primal. Little detail there. All right, let's look at what is probably my favorite Rodin sculpture. It's called The Burghers of Calais. And there's a really great story behind this sculpture. It was commissioned by the French town of Calais, and it was intended to commemorate an event that happened in the history of that town. During the Hundred Years' War in the 13 and 1400s, France and England were fighting each other. And the English had marched up to this town of Calais and were threatening to come in and totally demolish the town. And the leaders of the city elders or burghers, got together and they decided to walk out of the town wearing sackcloth with ropes around their necks and the key to the city. And their idea was to offer themselves up to the English army as victims, and in exchange for their town being spared. So they hoped to swap their lives for the lives of their citizens. And that's exactly what these burghers did. They walked out of their town humbly and humiliated and walked up to the English king on the battlefield and said, "We will offer you our lives if you will bypass our town and spare it and not kill everybody in it." And the king thought that was a pretty good idea. He was impressed with the boldness of these men, so he accepted their deal, and he was going to kill them, except I think the queen intervened and said, "These guys are awesome, you should let them go." So there was really a happy ending to this story. The city fathers are spared, the town is spared, and it creates a great story for the citizens of Calais to kind of base an identity on. And so for hundreds of years, the people of Calais had looked back to the story and said, "Man, this is a great example of what our town is all about. Awesome heroism, self-sacrifice." And so they commissioned a sculpture of these city burghers going out to meet their death. And they asked Rodin to do it, and Rodin worked on it for several years. And he sculpted the figures individually and then sort of put them all together on one base. And when he offered the sculpture to the people who commissioned it, they were actually pretty disappointed. They were hoping for a sculpture that showed these men being very heroic and brave looking and walking out unemotionally to meet their deaths. And instead, Rodin gives us this very intimate, very human view of six figures walking out, knowing that they're going to die. And each of these six figures is reacting to his own death in a different way. So if you walk around the Burghers of Calais sculpture, you can look into the faces of each one. One is stoic, one seems to be arguing, trying to explain why this is a good thing to do. Another man is thinking, this is a terrible idea. What am I doing? And he looks like he's in grief or cowardly. Another one looks quietly reflective, looking at the ground. So this is basically a study of the different ways in which human beings face their own mortality. And it's powerful and really emotional. And all of those things are reasons that the citizens of Calais didn't really like this sculpture. Rodin wanted it on the ground level so you could walk around the figures and get up close and experience what they were feeling. But in the end, they decided to put the sculpture up on a pedestal so you couldn't get as close to it to make them seem more heroic. And eventually, Rodin's wishes were honored. The sculpture made its way back down to the ground. And there are several places around the world where there are copies of this sculpture, and you can see it. A really great work and a wonderful story behind it. This last detail shows some of the roughness, some of the rough textures that Rodin is working with. Remember, he loves rough surfaces, the way they catch light and cast shade. And so you can see in this last detail the expressive hands on the head of this man who is just freaking out about going out to die. And look at the back of the head of the man at the top. You can see places where Rodin gouged the clay that he sculpted this in. In fact, that figure's hair almost looks like clumps of clay just sort of stuck on. So it's very rough, very loose and raw and emotional. And this sculpture has quite a bit of power. This last Rodin work that we're going to look at, called Monument to Balzac, is another famous work of his, one kind of like the Burghers of Calais that was met initially with derision and skepticism, and eventually people decided, yeah, I guess it is a good sculpture after all. There was a French literary society who commissioned Rodin to make a sculpture of Honoré Balzac, who was this famous French writer. Now, this posed a problem for the sculptor because Balzac had kind of a rotund figure. He had a pretty big belly, and that doesn't seem like a very sort of dramatic body type to make a sculpture of, especially if you keep in mind that during this time, idealized bodies were what was preferred by sculptors of the day. So Rodin thought about it, and he finally decided to wrap the figure in a bathrobe. And that's what we can see in these two different views at two different times of year of this sculpture. So we don't see the actual figure's physique. It's enclosed in the bathrobe, but Rodin doesn't have to deny the truth of his subject's body style. By the way, the actual writer Balzac was known for wearing a bathrobe, and kind of that was one of his trademarks. Rodin's Balzac doesn't really have both arms in the sleeves. You can see one sleeve of the robe just hangs down limply, and underneath the robe, this figure clasps his hands. Look at the face. The eyes are deeply gouged. They're very heavy eyebrows. Rodin is really aware that this is going to cast a deep shadow and add drama to this sculpture. Again, the rough, sort of loose surfaces. Critics initially, when they saw this, they were, of course, put off by it. In fact, I think that the literary society who commissioned it didn't accept it, and Rodin gave them their money back and took the sculpture and put it in his garden. And of course, since then, it's been hailed as a masterpiece. Here's a close-up of the head of Balzac. I should mention that this actually didn't even look very much like the famous author. What Rodin seemed to be after was not an actual literal likeness of the writer, but sort of a symbolic likeness. He wanted to capture sort of the spirit of Balzac. And this sculpture ultimately is about kind of the writer's creative process. It seems to be a sculpture about his creativity. Again, look at the rough surfaces. This is so Rodin, and it's going to be so influential on sculptors in the 20th century. Just marvelous play of light and shadow across the form of this bronze. All right, that wraps up our study of the Impressionists. Remember, this is a group of artists who are really interested in light and the effects of light, and that's what they're trying to capture in their canvases, and in the case of Rodin, bronze. In the next module, we will study some of the artists who come after the Impressionists and how they wanted to build off of the innovations of Impressionism. So I will see you in the next module, Module 12.